They say redemption cannot be bought. But I learned otherwise. In Jerusalem, the city of blood and prayer, I stood between heaven and men with gold in my hands. They came to me murderers, thieves, nobles, drunk on sin-seeking, not forgiveness, but permission to forget, and I sold it to them. Indulgences, they called them, sacred contracts sealed with my signature, my blessing, my silence. I told them their souls were clean, while their hands still dripped with the blood of their brothers. The church called me confessor, but I was a merchant, a broker between guilt and salvation, a priest who learned the language of transaction and called it grace. At first, I told myself it was for the poor, that every coin I took from the damned was bread for the hungry. But gold has a voice, and it whispers louder than conscience. Soon, I no longer prayed for their souls. I prayed for more customers. They say God sees everything. If that's true, He saw me weighing sins like spices in the market. He saw me turn redemption into currency. And He said nothing. Not when I took the gold. Not when I absolved the killers. Not when I looked up at the crucifix and felt ... nothing. Silence, I thought, meant approval. But silence is how God watches you damn yourself. Now I wait for morning bells I no longer deserve to hear. And I wonder, when I sold sainthood to murderers, did I damn them or did I damn Him? Jerusalem, in the year of our Lord 1131, was not the city Christ knew. The stones still carried the heat of holy fire, yes, but the prayers that rose from them smelled of coin and conquest. 30 years had passed since the Crusaders took these walls in the name of God. And in those 3 decades, we had learned to rebuild not just churches, but commerce. The holy and the profane had married here, in the shadow of Golgotha, and their children were men like me. I was young then, young enough to believe that faith and pragmatism could sleep in the same bed without one smothering the other. The monastery where I served stood near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, close enough that pilgrims would stumble to our doors with dust on their knees and tears on their faces. They came from every corner of Christendom, Franks with sun-cracked lips, Germans whose armor still bore the rust of blood, Italians who spoke in riddles and paid in silver. They came seeking absolution for sins I could barely imagine, and some I wished I couldn't. The system was simple, elegant, even. An indulgence was a remission of temporal punishment for sins already confessed and forgiven. The Church taught that penance could be performed through prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, or through charitable donation. The money, we were told, would fund monasteries, feed the poor, build hospitals for the sick. It was theology married to necessity. God's mercy flowing through golden channels into the coffers of the faithful. At first, I believed this. I would sit in the confessional, that wooden box that smelled of incense and guilt, and listen to merchants confess their greed, soldiers confess their violence, women confess their vanity. They would weep, they would promise to change, and then they would ask, sometimes with trembling voices, sometimes with the casual tone of men ordering wine, how much it would cost to shorten their time in purgatory. I would name a price. They would pay. I would write the indulgence on parchment, seal it with wax, and hand them a document that promised their suffering would be brief, that God had agreed to accept gold as penance. The first time I did this, my hands shook. The second time, they steadied. By the 100th time, they moved with the practiced ease of a merchant counting change. The pilgrims who came to Jerusalem were not ordinary sinners. These were men who had seen things that would make angels weep. Crusaders who had stood ankle-deep in Muslim blood when they took the city in 1099. Knights who had burned villages in Anatolia. Nobles who had left wives and children to die of starvation while they chased glory in the Levant. They came to the Holy Land thinking proximity to Christ's tomb would cleanse them, as if sacred geography could wash away what sacred ritual could not. And when geography failed, they came to me. I remember a Frankish lord, his name I have forgotten, though his face remains clear, who knelt before me, and confessed to having ordered the execution of 12 Muslim prisoners after promising them safe passage. He wept as he told me, real tears. He said he saw their faces every night, that they called to him in dreams, that he could taste their blood in his wine. "Can I be forgiven, Father?" he asked. I looked at him, this man who had broken faith with God and man both, and I thought about the theological answer. Forgiveness required true contrition, genuine repentance, a firm purpose of amendment. Did this man possess these things? I could not know. I could not see into his heart. Only God could judge the sincerity of his sorrow. But God was not sitting in this confessional. I was. "Your contrition is evident, my son," I said. "The church offers you a path to peace." I named a sum. It was large enough to feed 50 orphans for a month. Large enough to repair the roof of a chapel that leaked when it rained. He paid without hesitation, counting out coins that clinked like small bells in the silence of the chapel. I wrote the indulgence. My hand was steady. My conscience was clearer. So I told myself. That night, I distributed the gold. Half went to the monastery's coffers. Half I personally delivered to the hospice near the Damascus gate, where the poor lined up each evening for bread. I watched them eat, watched their children smile, watched life return to eyes that had been dull with hunger. This is holy work, I told myself. This is God's will made manifest. I have taken the guilt of the rich and transformed it into the sustenance of the poor. I have become an instrument of divine alchemy, turning sin into charity, damnation into salvation. Perhaps the devil's greatest trick is not making us believe he doesn't exist. Perhaps it is making us believe we are doing God's work while we do his. The line between my door grew longer each month. Word spread among the pilgrims and settlers that there was a monk in Jerusalem who understood the realities of the world, who did not demand impossible penances, who knew that a man could serve both God and his own comfort if he paid the right price. I became known, sought after, essential. Bishops would send wealthy sinners to me specifically, knowing I would extract generous donations. Other priests began to resent me, but they could not argue with the results. The monastery grew richer. The poor were fed. Churches were built. I was doing more good with my pragmatism than 100 idealistic priests could accomplish with their rigid theology. At night, I would kneel before the crucifix in my cell and pray. I thanked God for making me his instrument. I asked him to guide my hand, to help me discern true repentance from false. I prayed for the souls of those I had absolved, that their charity might indeed shorten their suffering. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes Nard would look up at Christ hanging on his cross and wonder if his silence was approval or accusation. The market ran every morning outside the monastery walls. Merchants selling spices from Egypt, silk from Damascus, weapons forged in European furnaces. The air smelled of cinnamon and sweat and animal dung. Men haggled in 6 languages, their voices rising and falling like waves on a shore. I would walk through that market on my way to morning prayers, and I began to notice something. The way merchants weighed goods, the way they negotiated prices, the way they smiled as they completed transactions, it was not so different from what I did in the confessional. They offered products, I offered absolution. They set prices based on demand. So did I, they counted their profits at day's end. So did I, the only difference was that they were honest about what they were selling. One morning, A young merchant stopped me. He sold dried figs from trees that grew near Jericho. "Father," he said, "I have a question about my soul." I expected confession. Instead, he asked, how much would it cost to absolve my grandfather? He died last year, unbaptized. The local priest says his soul is beyond saving. But I have heard that in Jerusalem, for the right price, even the damned can be reached. I should have explained the doctrine of purgatory, the limits of indulgences, the impossibility of posthumous baptism. I should have told him that some souls are beyond the church's reach, that gold cannot purchase what grace has not already granted. Instead, I named a price. He paid it. I wrote an indulgence for a dead man I had never met, for sins I could not catalogue, promising a mercy I had no authority to grant. That night, I did not distribute the money to the poor. I added it to my personal stores. Not because I needed it, my life was simple, my needs were few, but because something in me had shifted. The gold had become not a means, but an end. I counted the coins the way a miser counts his hoard, running my fingers over their smooth surfaces, feeling their weight, their realness, their power. Perhaps the inferno begins when you learn to negotiate with God, when you discover that the sacred can be priced, that the infinite can be measured, that heaven itself has a market value. I lay in my cell that night, unable to sleep, and I thought about the merchant in the market. How he smiled when a deal was done. How he tallied his profits without shame. And I realized I had learned to smile the same way. The difference was, he was selling figs, and I was selling God. The night arrived on a Thursday. I remember because Thursday was when we received the wine shipment from the vineyards near Bethlehem, and the air in the monastery courtyard was sharp with the smell of opened barrels and spilled vintage pritage. He came on horseback, though his mount looked barely able to carry him. The animal's ribs showed through its hide like the keys of a psaltery, and its eyes held the same exhausted desperation I would soon see in its master's face. He was Burgundian, from his accent, a crusader from the old families, the ones who had come with Godfrey of Bouillon to take Jerusalem in the name of Christ. His armor was expensive once, but now it was dented and poorly maintained. His surcoat bore a cross that had faded to the color of dried blood, which, I suppose, was appropriate. He did not announce himself to the porter. He came directly to the chapel, as if he knew exactly where to find me. I was hearing confessions that afternoon. 3 merchants, a widow, a young squire who had stolen bread from his master, ordinary sins, manageable sins, sins that could be weighed and priced and absolved before the bells rang for vespers. The knight waited until I was alone. Then he entered the confessional, and the wooden booth suddenly felt very small, as if his presence displaced all the air. He did not speak for a long time. I could hear his breathing, shallow, labored, like a man who had run a great distance. Finally, I prompted him with the traditional words, "Speak, my son. God is listening. Is he?" The knight's voice was a ruined thing, scraped raw, because I have been speaking to him for 3 years, and he has said nothing in return. I had heard this before, many times, the complaint of men who prayed and received no answer, who looked for signs and saw only silence. I had prepared responses for this, scriptural reassurances about faith and patience and the mysterious ways of providence. But something in his voice stopped me. "Tell me your sin," I said simply. And he did. It took an hour, maybe longer. Time becomes strange in the confessional, measured not in minutes but in the weight of words spoken into darkness. He had been part of the original conquest. 1099. The taking of Jerusalem. He described it with the precision of a man who has replayed the same scenes in his mind 1,000 times. the breaching of the walls, the flood of crusaders into the streets. The promise from the commanders, 3 days of pillage, as was the custom of war. 3 days to take whatever you wanted from the infidels who had held the holy city for too long. He described the killing methodically, without emotion, as if reading from a ledger. Women in the streets, children in their homes, old men in the mosques. They had been promised that Muslims who surrendered would be spared, but surrender came too slowly. Or the crusaders were too drunk on victory and bloodlust to honor promises made in the heat of battle. He had killed 47 people, he said. He had counted, first with his sword, then with his hands, when his sword arm grew tired, then with a mace he took from a fallen son. He described their faces, some terrified, some defiant, some simply confused, as if they could not understand why men who came in the name of a God of love were murdering them in the streets where Christ had walked. I told myself it was holy, he said, that God wanted this, that every death brought glory to Christ. But then, he stopped. I waited. There was a girl, no more than 10 years old. She was hiding in a house near the Temple Mount. I found her under a table. She looked at me with these wide eyes, and I saw, Father, I saw my own daughter in her face. My daughter was 8 when I left for the crusade. This Muslim girl looked just like her. Another pause, longer this time. I killed her anyway. The confession booth was silent except for his breathing. I killed her because, if I didn't, the others would have, and they would have done worse things first. I told myself I was being merciful. A quick death, no suffering. But mercy is not supposed to sound like a skull breaking open. Mercy is not supposed to smell like a child's blood soaking into stone. He continued, after Jerusalem there were other battles, other sieges, other cities that fell and burned and bled. He killed Muslims and Christians, both looters, deserters, anyone who stood between him and whatever small thing he wanted in that moment. He stole from churches, raped women whose husbands he had just murdered, burned villages to hide evidence of his crimes. I have confessed before, he said, 3 times. 2 priests in Antioch, Acre and Jaffa. They all said the same thing, that I fought in a holy cause, that my sins were understandable in the context of war, that God would forgive a soldier who fought in his name. They gave me light penances, prayers, fasting. One told me to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which I found amusing since I was standing in Jerusalem when he said it. But none of them, double quotes, he took a shuddering breath. None of them charged me for absolution. And I realized that meant they weren't really forgiving me. They were just, dismissing me. Telling me what I wanted to hear so I would leave their confessional and stop forcing them to imagine the things I had done. But you, he said, and I heard something change in his voice. I have heard about you. The monk who understands that real forgiveness has a real cost, who doesn't pretend that a few prayers can wash away blood, who knows that if salvation is worth anything, it must be worth something. He paused. I want to die clean, Father. My lungs are rotting. I can feel it. I have maybe a year, maybe less, and I cannot go to my judgment like this. I cannot stand before God wearing 47 murders and expect him to ignore them because I said 10 Hail Marys. So I have come to buy my way into heaven. I have sold everything. My land in Burgundy, my horses, my armor, everything but the clothes I wear and the money I carry. I have enough gold to build a church, to feed 1,000 orphans, to endow a monastery for 100 years. Is it enough, Father? I sat in the darkness of my side of the confessional, and I felt the weight of his question like a physical thing, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. This was different. This was not a merchant who had cheated customers, or a noble who had committed adultery. This was a man who had bathed in the blood of innocents, and now wanted me to tell him that gold could rinse it away. I thought about the theology I had learned in my novitiate, about contrition and penance and the limits of absolution. I thought about the doctrine that said some sins were so grave that only God could forgive them, that the Church's power to bind and loose had boundaries, that there were stains no earthly authority could remove. I thought about all of this for perhaps 10 seconds. Then I said, "It is enough." The sound that came from his side of the booth might have been a sob, or a laugh, or both. "Thank God," he whispered. "Thank God we discussed the price." I named a sum that would indeed feed 1,000 orphans and endow a monastery and build a church. He agreed without haggling. The next day, he returned with 2 chests of gold, more wealth than I had ever seen in one place. We counted it together in the monastery's treasury, and the sound of the coins as they fell from his hands into the chests was like rain on a copper roof, like applause, like the heartbeat of something vast and terrible that had just been born. I wrote the indulgence carefully, using my finest parchment and my most elaborate script. I sealed it with wax and pressed the monastery's seal into it while he watched. He held the document in his hands as if it were a fragment of the true cross itself, his fingers trembling, his lips moving in silent prayer. "Am I forgiven?" he asked. "You are forgiven," I said. He left the next morning. I heard later that he died 3 months afterward in a monastery in Acre, clutching the indulgence to his chest, his lips curved in a peaceful smile. I did not sleep that night, or the night after. I distributed the gold as I had always done, half to the monastery, half to charitable works. I commissioned the building of a chapel for lepers outside the city walls. I endowed a hospice for pilgrims. I arranged for bread to be distributed to the poor every Friday for the next 5 years. I did good things with that blood money, real, tangible good. But late at night, in my cell, I could hear the sound of those coins falling, over and over, and it sounded less like rain and more like something breaking. Something that, once broken, could never be made whole again. The young novice confronted me a week later. His name was Thomas, and he was 17 years old, newly arrived from France, with his faith still bright and sharp and uncompromised by the realities of the world. He had overheard the night's confession. The walls of the confessional were thin, and the night had not spoken quietly. The plague came in autumn, when the wind from the desert carried dust and dry heat that made the stones of Jerusalem shimmer like mirages. We called it the White Death because of how it drained the color from its victims. They would sicken overnight healthy, at sunset, fever-racked by dawn. Their skin would turn pale as parchment, their lips blue, their eyes sunken deep into their skulls. They would beg for water, but could not keep it down. They would cry out for family members, for priests, for God himself. And then they would die. It started in the poorest quarters, where people lived packed together in houses that were little more than stacked stones and hope. Then it spread to the markets, the churches, the noble houses. Within a month, the city smelled of nothing but death and the smoke from funeral pyres that burned day and night outside the Damascus gate. The monastery became a hospital by necessity. We had space, we had supplies, we had priests who could give last rites. The sick came in waves, carried by family members, brought by friends, sometimes crawling on their own hands and knees because no one else would touch them. I moved among them like a merchant taking inventory. This one will die by nightfall. That one might last 2 days. This child is already gone, though her heart still beats. I performed last rites until the Latin words became meaningless sounds, until I could no longer remember what the prayers were supposed to mean. I anointed them with oil. I held crosses to their lips. I whispered promises of paradise to people whose last moments on earth were spent coughing blood onto stone floors. And I felt nothing. That was the worst part. Not that I was surrounded by death. I had seen death before, had blessed dying men on battlefields and in sick rooms. But this was different. I moved through that suffering like a man walking through a dream, disconnected, observing my own actions from a distance. I would kneel beside a dying child and whisper the prayers for the departing soul. And part of me would wonder if there was still time to collect the fees I was owed from yesterday's confessions. I would hold the hand of a weeping mother and think about the gold in the treasury below, calculating how much we would need to spend on additional oil for the lamps. I tried to pray. God, I said in the silence of my cell, give me compassion, give me grief, give me anything that proves I am still human, still capable of feeling what I should feel. The words went up like smoke and vanished into darkness. I tried harder. I knelt until my knees bled. I fasted until I grew dizzy. I recited psalms until my voice gave out. And still nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing in an empty room, and beyond that, the sound of people dying in the wards above. If prayer is supposed to be a conversation, then I was talking to myself. One night, or was it day? Time had become liquid. Meaningless, I fell asleep at my desk. My head resting on a ledger where I had been recording the names of the dead. When I woke, the lamp had burned down to nothing, and the darkness was absolute. But I was not alone. I cannot say if what I saw was vision or fever or the product of a mind pushed past its breaking point. But there, in the darkness of my cell, I saw the crucifix on the wall move. Christ descended from his cross. He did not float or glow or manifest in any of the ways the saints' stories described divine appearances. He simply ... stepped down, as if the wood had been a doorway and he had finally decided to walk through it. He was naked except for the loincloth, his body marked with wounds that did not bleed but somehow looked fresh, as if they had never healed and never would. He moved slowly, stiffly, like a man who had been hanging in one position for too long. He crossed the cell, stood before my desk, looked down at me with eyes that held no anger, no judgment, just a terrible, infinite sadness. Then he reached into his own wounds, into the hole in his side where the spear had pierced him, and he pulled out coins. One by one, gold coins that gleamed in the darkness, identical to the ones I kept in the treasury below. He laid them on my desk in front of me. Each coin made a small sound as it touched the wood knot, the chiming ring of metal on metal, but something softer, wetter, like the sound of blood dripping into a basin. When he had emptied his wounds, he looked at me again. His lips moved, he spoke, but no sound came out. I think he was saying my name. Or maybe he was asking a question. Or maybe he was simply trying to remember how speech worked after 2,000 years of silence. Then he turned and walked back to the wall, climbed onto the cross, as if mounting a horse, and resumed his position of perpetual dying. I woke with my head on the desk, lamplight streaming through the window, birdsong in the courtyard. Morning, real morning. Not the dream or vision or whatever I had experienced in the darkness. But the coins were still there. 30 pieces of gold lay scattered across my desk, arranged in no particular pattern. I picked one up with trembling fingers. It was cold and heavy and absolutely real. I counted them, 30 exactly. The price of betrayal. The price of Christ. I thought I would feel horror, shame, recognition of some divine judgment being passed. Instead, I felt something worse, relief. Because if God was returning the money, that meant he acknowledged the transaction. That meant salvation really was something that could be bought and sold. That meant I had not been lying when I told all those men and women that their gold could purchase mercy. God had confirmed it. The business was legitimate. I gathered up the 30 coins and took them down to the treasury. The monk who kept the records, a thin man named Peter, who had a gift for numbers and no gift at all for questions, added them to the ledgers without comment. Just another deposit. Just another day's work in the market of souls. That evening, I met with the bishop. He had come to inspect our response to the plague, to ensure the monastery was fulfilling its obligations to the sick and dying. We walked through the wards together, past rows of makeshift beds where people lay in various stages of departure from this world. "You have done well, Father," the bishop said. He was a Lombard, fat and shrewd. The kind of man who had risen in the church through careful politics and careful piety in equal measure. "The monastery's reputation has grown considerably under your guidance. Your approach to spiritual care is ... innovative." "Innovative," I repeated. "Practical," he amended. "You understand that the church must meet the needs of the modern age. That we cannot simply rely on the old ways, the old rigidities. You have transformed guilt into divine wealth. You have made repentance accessible to those who might otherwise die in their sins." He placed a hand on my shoulder. His fingers were heavy with rings that probably cost more than a year's worth of bread for the poor. "There are those in Rome who have noticed your work," he continued, "who see in your methods a model for how the church might operate more ... efficiently, more profitably. Continue as you have been, Father. Continue to transform the leaden weight of sin into the gold of salvation. That is alchemy worthy of God himself." He left. I stood in the ward, surrounded by the dying, and I thought about his words. Divine wealth, efficient operation, profitable transformation. The language of the counting house applied to the currency of souls. And then I thought about Christ descending from the cross to return the money I had taken. And I realized perhaps he was not confirming the transaction. Perhaps he was returning it because he wanted no part of it. Perhaps divine silence is not absence. Perhaps it is the only response God has left when his children have become so corrupted that words would be wasted on them. Perhaps God does not speak because he has learned from watching me the terrible price of silence. That sometimes the cruelest thing you can do to someone is let them continue on their chosen path without interruption. Let them build their towers of gold and pride until they stand so high that the fall becomes inevitable. Let them sell salvation until they forget what salvation means. I climbed the stairs to my cell that night, my legs heavy, my mind emptier than it had ever been. I lay on my cot and stared at the crucifix on the wall back in its place, Christ hanging in his eternal dying. His wounds closed now, his face turned away, and I thought, perhaps God does not speak because I taught him that silence can be bought, that even heaven has a price, and once you name it, once you put it in writing, once you seal it with wax and exchange it for gold, what is there left to say? The words of prayer curdle into copper taste. The sacred becomes stock to be traded. And God remains silent because silence is the last mercy he can offer to a soul that has learned to calculate the value of everything and the worth of nothing. Outside, the plague continued. The pyres burned, the dead multiplied. And I lay in my cell with 30 pieces of silver in the treasury below, and no prayers left in my mouth that tasted like anything but lies. She came 6 months after the plague ended. The woman was perhaps 40 years old, though grief had aged her in ways that time alone could not accomplish. Her clothes were well made but worn widow's black that had seen too many washings, a veil that had been mended more than once. Her hands shook as she pulled back the veil to look at me, and I saw that her eyes were the kind of empty that comes not from the absence of feeling but from its exhaustion. She had cried until there were no tears left, raged until there was no rage left, and now she was simply ... hollow. "You absolved my husband," she said without preamble. We were in the chapel, where I had been lighting candles for evening prayers. The light made shadows dance across the walls, turning the painted saints into something that writhed and twisted. 5 years ago, he came to you with gold, and you gave him forgiveness for his sins. I had absolved hundreds of men in 5 years, perhaps thousands. I could not possibly remember them all. I absolve many penitents, I said carefully. If your husband sought, he murdered our son. The candle I was holding slipped from my fingers. It fell to the stone floor and went out, the trail of smoke rising like a departing spirit. Your husband, I said slowly, confessed to murdering your son, and I gave him absolution. My son was 15 years old. He discovered that his father was keeping a mistress in Acre, spending money that should have gone to our household. They argued. My husband struck him just once, he said, just once, but the boy fell and hit his head on the corner of a table, and he never woke up. She spoke without inflection, as if reciting a story she had told so many times that it had lost all meaning. My husband came to you. He told you what he had done. He paid you 500 gold pieces, gold he had inherited from his father, gold that should have been our son's inheritance. And you told him he was forgiven. You gave him a document that said his soul was clean. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a piece of parchment. Even from where I stood, I could see my own handwriting, my own seal pressed into the wax. She held it up like an accusation. He carried this until the day he died. 3 years ago, fever took him. He was delirious at the end, but he kept clutching this paper and saying, "I am forgiven." The monk said so. "I am forgiven," over and over, until his last breath. "I am forgiven." As if those words could bring our son back, as if gold could wash blood from stone. I remembered him then, a merchant from Jaffa. Yes, I remembered the confession, the accidental death, the grief that seemed genuine, the enormous sum he offered. I remembered thinking that such wealth could do so much good, that refusing it would be wasteful, that the man's contrition seemed real enough. I remembered writing the indulgence and feeling satisfied that I had brought peace to a troubled soul and funds to feed the hungry. I had not asked if he had a wife, had not asked about the dead boy's mother, had not considered that there might be other victims beyond the one who died. "I am sorry for your loss," I said, and the words tasted like sand in my mouth. "Are you?" She stepped closer. "Are you sorry? Or are you simply uncomfortable that someone has come to show you the cost of your transactions?" Your husband was genuinely repentant. My husband was terrified of hell, she interrupted. That is not the same thing as repentance. He did not weep for our son. He wept for himself. He wanted to escape punishment, not to face what he had done, and you gave him that escape. You told him that gold could substitute for justice, that payment could replace transformation. You let him die, believing himself forgiven, while I was left with nothing, no son, no husband who had the courage to live with his guilt, no possibility of anything approaching justice. She laid the indulgence on the altar between us. I have come to buy salvation for my son. The same salvation you sold to the man who killed him. I have sold everything, my house, my jewelry, my husband's remaining properties. I have exactly 500 gold pieces, the same amount he paid you. I want an indulgence for my boy. I want you to promise me that his soul is safe, that he is in heaven, that God has taken him into his mercy. I stared at the document lying on the altar, at my own handwriting promising redemption to a killer. And for the first time in years, perhaps the first time since I had begun this work, I felt something crack inside me. "I cannot do that," I said. "Why not? You did it for him. You took gold and promised salvation. Why can't you do the same for an innocent child? Is his soul worth less than a murderer's? Your son died sinless. He was not baptized in the final anointing. He died suddenly, with no priest present. According to doctrine, his soul may be in limbo, suspended, neither saved nor damned. I want you to save him the way you saved his killer. I want you to take my gold and promise me he is in paradise. The church does not teach. The church teaches whatever you want it to teach." Her voice cracked, the first emotion breaking through the numbness. "You have already proven that. You have sold absolution to rapists and thieves and killers. You have put prices on sins that should be beyond pricing. You have made the infinite finite, the sacred profitable. So do it now. Take my gold, write your document, seal it with your wax, and tell me my son is saved." I looked at the 500 gold pieces she had laid beside the indulgence. The exact same amount her husband had paid to ease his conscience while hers remained in torment. And I could not do it. Not because of theology, not because of doctrine, not because the church forbade it, or because an unbaptized innocent was already assumed into heaven, or because indulgences did not work retroactively on those already dead. I could not do it because, in that moment, I finally saw what I had become. I had told myself I was helping people, that I was making salvation accessible, that I was using the wealth of sinners to help the poor, and if that required bending some theological niceties, well, God would understand. God would see the good I was doing and forgive the compromises I was making. But this woman showed me the truth. I had not been helping anyone. I had been giving permission to sin without consequence, permission to harm without transformation, permission to buy off guilt instead of confronting it, to purchase absolution instead of pursuing change. I had told murderers they were forgiven without requiring them to face their victims' families. I had told thieves they were clean without requiring them to return what they had stolen. I had told adulterers and liars and abusers that gold could substitute for amendment of life. I had broken the machinery of redemption and called it efficiency. "No," I whispered. "What? No, I will not take your gold. I will not write you an indulgence. I cannot give you what you ask." Something changed in her face. The emptiness filled with something hot and terrible. "Why?" she demanded. "Tell me why. Is it because he is already saved and does not need it? Or is it because you finally recognize that what you have been doing is sacrilege? That you have been selling something that was never yours to sell?" I had no answer. "You are a fraud," she said quietly. "Worse than a fraud. A fraud simply lies. But you take the hope of the desperate and you transform it into coin. You take the sacred and you debase it. You take God's mercy and you make it a commodity." She spit on the altar. The saliva struck the indulgence I had written for her husband, soaking into the parchment. "I hope you choke on your gold," she said. "I hope every coin you have ever taken turns to poison in your mouth. I hope that when you finally stand before God, He asks you to name the price of His Son's blood, and I hope you give Him the answer you gave my husband, that everything, even salvation, even grace, even God Himself, can be bought for the right sum." She took her gold and left. I heard her footsteps echoing through the chapel, growing fainter, finally disappearing. I stood alone in the candlelight, looking at the soiled indulgence on the altar, and I thought, who absolves the absolver? That question haunted me through the weeks that followed. I tried to confess to other priests, to seek absolution for the absolutions I had wrongly granted. But they would not hear me. The first priest I approached was an elderly Franciscan who served in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I knelt in his confessional and tried to explain what I had done, not just the mechanical facts of selling indulgences, but the spiritual reality of it. How I had transformed mercy into merchandise. How I had let men buy their way out of guilt without requiring them to change. He listened patiently. Then he said, "But you have brought wealth to the church. You have fed the poor. You have built hospitals and chapels. Surely the good you have done outweighs any theological irregularities in your methods." I gave a murderer permission to die at peace while his victim's mother lives in torment. You gave a penitent absolution. What he did with that absolution, how his family responded, these are not your responsibility. You acted within your authority as a priest. You harmed no one. I harmed everyone. But he could not understand. Or would not. He gave me a light penance and Hail Marys, a day of fasting, and sent me away with his blessing. I tried again with a younger priest, a Dominican who had a reputation for intellectual rigor. Surely he would understand the theological problems, the corruption of the sacramental system, the ways I had violated the very principles of repentance and transformation. He listened. He even seemed troubled. But in the end, he said, "The Church has approved the practice of indulgences. Rome itself sanctions it. If there are abuses in how it is implemented, that is a matter for bishops and councils to decide, not individual priests. Your conscience should be clear. You operated within the system. The system is broken. Then reform it. But do not imagine that your personal guilt can undo the entire structure of church finance. The poor will not cease being hungry if you stop collecting gold from penitents. The churches will not cease needing repair. The system works, Father. Perhaps not perfectly, but it works." I tried a third time, with an elderly Benedictine, who was known for his sanctity. Surely a holy man would see what I had done. Surely someone who had lived his entire life in prayer would recognize the spiritual bankruptcy at the heart of my work. But he was the worst of all. "God has given you a gift," he said. "The ability to bring peace to troubled souls. The ability to transform the wealth of sinners into bread for the starving. You should thank him for this gift, not question it. Your doubts are a temptation, Father. The devil does not want you to continue your good work. He whispers accusations in your ear to make you abandon your ministry. Resist him. Continue as you have been. Trust that God will sort out any irregularities in the final accounting." I left his confessional with my sins unabsolved and my questions unanswered. Because the truth was, there was no one who could absolve me. The entire system was complicit. The bishops knew what I was doing and approved because it brought revenue. The other priests knew and said nothing because they benefited from the funds I raised. The abbots and priors and cardinals all knew, and they all sanctioned it. Because a church that could transform sin into gold was a church that could feed armies and build cathedrals and compete with kings, I was not an aberration. I was the system working exactly as designed, and there was no confession for that. No penance, no absolution. In my cell at night, I would stare at my hands. They looked the same as they always had. Pale, thin, marked with ink stains from my work in the scriptorium. But I imagined I could see gold dust on them, permanent, ingrained in the skin like dye. I tried to wash them. I scrubbed until the skin cracked and bled. But the gold real or I thought of King Midas in the old pagan stories, who wished that everything he touched would turn to gold. Who got his wish and discovered too late that gold cannot be eaten, cannot be loved, cannot sustain life, who turned his own daughter into a golden statue with his cursed touch. I had not been cursed by a god, I had cursed myself. I had learned to measure everything in gold, suffering in gold, guilt in gold, mercy in gold, redemption in gold, until gold became the only language I knew how to speak. And now I had forgotten how to speak anything else. The treasury beneath the monastery held enough wealth to feed Jerusalem for a year. Every coin in it had a story, a sin it represented, a soul it supposedly saved, a piece of suffering or guilt or fear transformed into metal. I went down there late one night when the other monks were sleeping. I lit a lamp and stood among the chests of gold, and I tried to remember why I had thought this was holy work. The gold gleamed in the lamplight, beautiful, eternal, pure, and utterly silent. I thought, this is what I have created. A room full of suffering, refined and transformed, and stored away in the dark. A treasure built from pain. A fortune accumulated from the desperate hope that money can substitute for grace. I picked up a coin, held it to the light, saw my own face reflected in its surface, distorted, grotesque. This coin, I thought, might have come from the knight who killed 47 people, or from the merchant who killed his son, or from any of 1,000 other sinners who brought me their guilt and their gold and left with a piece of parchment that promised them heaven. And I had no way to know which coin was which. They had all become identical, interchangeable, pure gold with no memory of where it came from or what it cost. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps that was always the point. To make sin indistinguishable from charity. To make damnation indistinguishable from salvation. To make everything the same, everything equivalent, everything reducible to weight and measure and price. To make God himself just another commodity to be traded in the marketplace of Jerusalem. I put the coin back in the chest, extinguished the lamp, climbed the stairs to my cell, and I thought, the gold is cold. It has always been cold. Even when I counted it, even when I distributed it, even when I told myself it would do good, it was always cold, because gold has no warmth of its own. It only reflects the heat of the hand that holds it. And my hands had been cold for a very long time. I am an old man now. My hands shake when I write, and my eyes water from the strain of candlelight. The monastery where I once served is far behind. I left it years ago. Too ashamed to remain, too cowardly to confess publicly what I had done. I wander from church to church now, from monastery to monastery, taking temporary work, copying manuscripts, or teaching novices, never staying long enough for anyone to ask questions about my past. But the past follows me. It is patient, relentless. It waits in every chapel I enter, every confessional I pass, every altar where the host is elevated and the priest speaks the words of consecration. This body broken for you, this blood shed for you. And I think, but what is the price? How many pieces of silver? How much gold does it take to purchase the sacrifice of God? I am writing this in a cold cell in a monastery near Tyre. I do not know the brothers here well. I do not want to. In a few months, perhaps weeks, I will move on again, driven by the same restlessness that has haunted me since I left Jerusalem. Or perhaps I will die here. The cough that has plagued me for months has grown worse. There is blood on my handkerchief now, bright and undeniable. My body is betraying me the way I betrayed everything I once claimed to believe. And so I write this confession, this testimony, this account of how a priest became a merchant and transformed the infinite into the finite and learned, too late, that some things cannot be priced because they should never be sold. I sent the gold away, all of it. Not just the gold in the treasury, but every coin I had ever taken, every piece I had ever held. I arranged for it to be distributed to the poor across Palestine, in Jerusalem, in Acre, in Antioch, in every city where I had ever taken payment for absolution. I commissioned masses for the souls of those I had absolved, though I doubt the prayers did any good. I funded the building of 3 hospitals, 2 orphanages, and a hospice for lepers. I emptied myself of gold the way a physician lances a wound, hoping that if I drained the poison, the healing might begin. But the gold was not the sickness. It was only the symptom. The sickness was deeper. It was in my soul, in the fundamental architecture of how I understood the relationship between heaven and earth, between God and man, between sin and redemption. I had believed, truly believed, that I was doing good work, that I was making salvation accessible to those who needed it, using the wealth of the guilty to help the innocent. I had constructed an entire theology to justify my actions, a careful edifice of logic and pragmatism that explained why bending the rules was not only acceptable but necessary. But the woman with the dead son had shown me the truth. Every transaction I conducted, every indulgence I wrote, every absolution I sold, these were not acts of mercy. They were acts of permission. Permission for the powerful to harm the powerless without consequence. Permission for guilt to be transferred rather than confronted. Permission for sin to continue because its price had already been paid. I had not been selling salvation. I had been selling permission to damn oneself while feeling saved. And the gold I gave to the poor, that did not redeem the system. It only made the system more insidious. It gave us, gave the entire church the excuse we needed to continue. We fed the hungry, we clothed the naked, we sheltered the homeless. And we told ourselves that this justified everything else. That the good we did with blood money sanctified the blood from which it came. But charity built on injustice is not charity. It is simply injustice with better public relations. I think often of the knight who came to me with 47 murders on his conscience. I wonder if he really found peace before he died, or if the indulgence I gave him was just a drug, a narcotic that numbed the pain without healing the wound. I think of the merchant who killed his son and died believing himself forgiven while his wife lived on in torment. I think of all the men and women who came to me seeking not transformation, but transaction, who wanted to buy their way past the narrow gate instead of walking through it, stripped of everything but their naked souls. And I think I helped them. I helped them avoid the very thing that might have saved them, the confrontation with their own guilt. The long, painful journey of repentance. The slow reconstruction of a life bent toward holiness instead of profit. I gave them the easy path, the comfortable path, the path that required nothing but gold. And in doing so, I damned them more surely than any of their actual sins could have done. There is a story I heard once from a Jewish rabbi who lived in Jerusalem. It is about a man who committed a terrible sin and went to his rabbi seeking forgiveness. The rabbi told him, "You must carry a pillow to the top of the highest hill outside the city. There, you must tear the pillow open and let the feathers scatter in the wind. Then come back to me." The man did as instructed. He carried the pillow to the hilltop, tore it open, and watched the feathers scatter across the landscape. Carried by the wind into places he could not see, he returned to the rabbi. "I have done as you asked." "Good," the rabbi said. "Now go and collect all the feathers." "But that's impossible," the man protested. "They have scattered everywhere. The wind has carried them to places I cannot reach. I could search for years and never find them all." "Exactly," the rabbi said, "and that is the nature of sin. Once released, it scatters. It touches lives you will never know about. It creates consequences you cannot foresee or control. you cannot simply undo it. You cannot gather back what has been scattered. The only thing you can do is learn to live with the knowledge of what you have done and commit yourself to scattering good instead of harm in the future. I think about that story often now. About all the feathers I scattered. All the consequences I set in motion that I will never see, never know about, never be able to repair. Somewhere, right now, there might be a man who murdered someone and walks free because I told him his gold had purchased forgiveness. Somewhere there might be a widow weeping because the man who harmed her died, believing himself forgiven while she remains without justice. Somewhere there might be a village that starves because a local lord spent his wealth on indulgences instead of caring for his people. And I will never know about any of it. The feathers are scattered. The wind has taken them beyond my reach. This is the real weight of redemption, that it costs something, but that some costs cannot be paid, that some broken things cannot be repaired, that some sins scatter consequences that can never be gathered back. I was wrong about God's silence. All those years, I thought his silence meant approval or indifference. I thought he was not speaking because he did not care what I did, or because he was too distant to notice, or because he had given up on a world too fallen to save. But now, in this cold cell, with blood on my handkerchief and the sound of midnight bells ringing across the city, I understand. God's silence was not absence. It was patience. He was waiting for me to hear something other than the sound of gold coins chiming in the treasury, waiting for me to see something other than my own reflection in the surface of wealth, waiting for me to understand that his mercy is not a commodity to be traded, but a gift to be received, and that gift-giving and commerce are opposite things, not similar ones. In commerce, you get what you pay for. Equivalent exchange. Transaction completed. Both parties walk away satisfied that they received fair value. But in gift-giving, there is no equivalence. The gift is always disproportionate, too much or too little. It creates not balance, but relationship. It creates not satisfaction, but gratitude and obligation and connection. God's mercy is a gift, an absurd, disproportionate, incomprehensible gift. It cannot be earned or purchased or negotiated for. It can only be received with empty hands and a broken heart. And I tried to turn that gift into a commodity. I tried to make it fair, proportionate, transactional. I tried to make it into something that could be measured and priced and distributed according to market principles. In doing so, I did not make mercy more accessible. I made it less real. I transformed the infinite into the finite, the sacred into the profane, the gift into the purchase. I sold God, not to murderers, though they were among my customers, not for gold, though that was the currency I accepted. I sold God by making him reasonable, by making his mercy something that made sense according to the logic of markets and exchanges, by stripping away the scandal and the absurdity and the wildness of grace and replacing it with something tame and manageable and profitable. I made God safe, and in making him safe, I made him false. The Christ who died on the cross died for all, for free, without price or condition or calculation. His blood was shed, and the veil was torn, and the gates of heaven were opened, and the only price paid was paid by him, not by us. That is the scandal. That is the absurdity. That is the thing I could not accept, and so tried to improve with my system of indulgences and transactions. I tried to make people pay because I could not accept that the payment had already been made. I hear the bells ringing for morning prayers. I will not attend. The other monks do not know me well, but they know me well enough to see that I am dying. They will not force a dying man to observe the hours. Besides, I am no longer certain I have the right to approach the altar, to speak the words of consecration, to lift the host, to claim that I am acting in persona Christian, the person of Christ. How can I represent Christ when I sold him? But perhaps this is itself a vanity. This belief that my betrayal is somehow unique or unprecedented or beyond redemption. After all, Christ chose 12 apostles, and one of them sold him for 30 pieces of silver, and another denied him 3 times before the cock crowed, and all of them abandoned him in his moment of greatest need. The church was built on the foundation of betrayers and cowards and liars who somehow, despite everything, were transformed into saints. Perhaps there is hope even for someone like me. Or perhaps I am simply doing what I have always done, calculating the odds, weighing the costs, trying to determine if redemption is available at a price I can afford to pay. Old habits die hard. Or perhaps they never die at all. Perhaps they simply become quieter, less obvious, more sophisticated in how they express themselves. I do not know if God will forgive me. I do not know if I even have the right to ask. The woman whose son died was right. I am a fraud. Worse than a fraud, I took the hope of the desperate and turned it into currency. I took the sacred and made it profane. I took God's mercy and put a price on it. But I know this: I cannot forgive myself, and I should not. Self-forgiveness, in this case, would be just another transaction, me absolving myself the way I absolved all those others, without requiring real transformation or repentance. No, I will carry this. I will carry the weight of what I have done until I die, and I will not seek to put it down through any clever theological trick or spiritual loophole. This is my penance. Not prayers or fasting or pilgrimage, but simply this: to know what I have done, to see it clearly without excuse or justification, and to live with that knowledge until death releases me. And then perhaps, then I will discover what lies beyond the gold, beyond the transactions, beyond the careful calculations and the managed risks and the profitable exchanges. Perhaps I will discover whether God's mercy is real when there is no gold to pay for it. The bells are ringing now. Morning has come to the city. I can hear footsteps in the corridor outside my cell as the brothers make their way to prayers. The sounds of life continuing. The world moving forward without me. I set down my pen. The confession is complete. I will leave it here, on this desk, for whoever finds it after I am gone. Let them read it. Let them know what I did. Let them understand how easy it is to betray everything while believing you are serving faithfully. Let them know that God remained silent through it all, not because he was absent, but because he was waiting. Waiting for the sound of gold to stop ringing in my ears. Waiting for me to hear his voice, which speaks not in thunder or earthquake or fire, but in silence. And perhaps in that silence, he was answering me all along, not with approval or condemnation, not with acceptance or rejection, but with the patient, terrible love that allows his children to make their choices and live with the consequences, all the while waiting for them to turn back toward the light. I hear the bells, the morning bells I no longer deserve to hear. God remained silent, and perhaps in that silence he finally spoke to me. Perhaps he said, "I am here, I have always been here, and even now, even after everything, I am still here." Or perhaps he said nothing at all, and I will spend eternity wondering whether his silence was mercy or judgment, grace or abandonment, the closing of a door or the opening of one I was too blind to see. The bells ring. Morning breaks over the city, and I am forgiven, or I am damned, or perhaps I am simply human, caught between heaven and hell. carrying the weight of gold that I can never put down and the hope of grace I can never earn. Somewhere in that space between what I sold and what I surrendered, between what I deserved and what I received, between the gold and the crossbar, perhaps there is redemption. Or perhaps there is only the silence of God, which is the only answer some of us will ever hear. The end.